Hello and welcome to We Are the Deluge, a no longer spoiler-free chapter-by-chapter podcast about the climate change novel The Deluge by Stephen Markley. We are your co-hosts, Emily Crandall and John McMahon, living out our Deluge podcast hosting dreams. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Stephen Markley, author of The Deluge. He is also the author of Ohio, published this book and Tales of Iceland, and a writer on the TV shows Paradise and Only Murders in the Building. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
We have a very
question to start with. Deluge or deluge?
I always was saying deluge in my head as I was writing it. And then as soon as I turned the book in, everybody was saying deluge back to me. So I became very nervous that I didn't know the title of my own novel. But I think it's interchangeable.
I think like with much of this novel, like the multiple interpretations, like I think that's
exactly.
I like it.
I feel very validated that was your thinking though, because when I picked it up and when I was reading it, I heard deluge and I started talking about it to people and everybody said deluge back to me also. And so it's an interesting experience to have read 900 pages. I imagine to have spent 900 pages in 10 years or 10 plus years writing it and then to be told back something different. It's an interesting experience.
Exactly.
Okay, so we'd like to begin with a little bit of a form and perspective question. So obviously you didn't invent multiple points of view in a novel, but we actually kind of tried the gimmick of like having each character actually have a different form for the podcast, and it was really hard. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the choice to write each point of view in a different form and kind of what the experience of that was like.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it was driven by just like what I needed from the voice. I think with like a character like Matt, who's telling this love story, like being in the first person was sort of crucial to getting that proximity psychologically to his sort of heartache. With a character like Tony, I always kind of knew where Tony was going to, like, why his story was being told this way. We can get into that more in a little bit, but he's also somebody who's, I think, like a bit removed from his own emotional life and his own sort of sense of himself, and so like that little like edge of psychological distance, I think helped write the character. And then sometimes, with Keeper, which is second person, it's really just instinct. After I finished Ohio, I had sort of all these spare parts lying around, including this like fragment that was no character in that book, but I was always like really sort of gripped by. And that fragment ended up becoming Keeper's first chapter. And at first I was like, I don't know if this character is going to be in the rest of this novel. Like, I'm not sure what he's doing here exactly. But, as I moved forward with the book, I sort of figured out that like he was in many ways like the most important character, maybe not the main character, maybe not the heart of the book, but sort of the person who made the world feel fully lived in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe we can follow up about Keeper. So Stephen, I mentioned this to you over email, but we'll tell our listeners that I've taught this novel twice. And so the second time I taught it, my students, I told them, all right, we're going to email Stephen Markley, see if he can come on the podcast. And then the students wrote some questions on the last day we talked about the novel. So I've got a couple of questions from my students, and one of them is about Keeper. So shouts, honors 315. And their question is, why did you write Keeper's chapter in the second person, and how did you see him fitting into the novel? And then if I can add a little bit of context, that's a little bit about, you said he might not be the main character, but might be the kind of heart of the novel. And for Emily and I, part of that is that he is experiencing climate change, and so much of his chapters are about the weather and what it feels like, right, to live in a warming, colding, oscillating world. So how does he kind of fit into the novel?
I've heard Keeper called before, an everyman, and I like that's a fine sort of like tropey description. But I think to me it was like, this is how most Americans and many people around the world live their lives. Experiencing these just like horrific, catastrophic disasters. But with that separation of like, it doesn't occur to me that this is being caused by the combustion engine in my car. This is being caused by a coal plant, and that there are political actors behind that coal plant and behind that gas powered car and behind that natural gas operation who are, catalyzing these horrifying floods in Texas that killed all those girls at that camp, that are, bringing rain down on Asheville and like wiping out that city in a matter of hours. These fires in LA, a perfect example of how, that's one I lived through, like we lived through these, like, just like in the book, I call them just these weather events from another dimension. And I think like having a character who is deeply in that point of view of not giving a fuck about climate change and not making those connections was so important to building out the world of the novel, and so important to, sort of capturing what it feels like to be alive at this moment, or in the book's case, like slightly in the future, which is that not only are all these horrific things happening to us, but we're sort of blind as to why and what we can do about it.
Mm-hmm. I want to just ask one more keeper question, but that must have been so, bizarre does not cut it to have written El Demonio and then be in LA for the fires. I can't imagine what that must have been like.
Yes, it was a complete head fuck from top to bottom. The book had just pubbed in Italy. The Italian translation had just come out maybe like a couple weeks before. And so I was not only like watching the smoke from the Palisades from my balcony of where I was living, but also like getting up at like 5 a.m., 6 a.m. to like talk to Italian journalists who are like, how did you know this was going to happen? As with so many of sort of the prophetic elements about the book, it's no, psychic abilities on my part. It is strictly looking at exactly the environmental, economic, and political trends, and extrapolating from there. The way that fire started was exactly how it happens in the novel, which is a couple of rainy seasons followed by a dry snap, followed by record-setting Santa Ana winds. And that's like the perfect cocktail for something that, was just, it's crazy because like I felt like that was like the most staggering thing to live through and see with my own eyes. And then like everybody forgot about it a month later. Like it just vanished from the news. Yeah. So it was just like, this is the head spinning way we live now.
Yeah. Okay. One last keeper question. So you said that he began as a fragment from Ohio, and you were sort of like, what's he doing in this novel? At any point did anyone, who was part of the process of making the novel come to life, like question his addition in the novel? Did you have to fight for him? We both love the keeper chapters so much. And like the whole time we're like, what does it mean for us that keepers are like our favorite character in this book? Yeah. And like as a reader, thinking about where you position yourself in a novel like this, it's like, we just talked so much about those chapters and like, what it meant for us to read those chapters. I was just curious if anyone at any point was like, why is this character here?
Yeah, not anybody who read the complete form of the novel, because I feel like once I figured it out, it was one of those beautiful moments as a writer where like something snaps into place so perfectly. And, it was about halfway through. I think it was by the time I'd written the chapter where he is going on like an alcoholic binge, like crazed, like out of his mind. And then, his reverend sort of like saves him that day. And like, I was like, oh, okay, like this character, this is about a human being trying to fight his way back to his own humanity, but without the tools or the sort of social structures that might help him do it. So he's like white knuckling his way through this entire process. And how will he, eventually find his way back to that? And I think by the time you get to the end of the novel, when it's this is a spoiler thing, like he's committing this like horrible act of violence, but he's also like bargaining for every last life he can that's not his own. And I just like, as soon as I had that in my head, I was like, that's a fucking awesome thing to write towards.
And the end is, stunning. It's so beautifully rendered. And it is like he's redeemed in some way, right? we spent so long being like, is this a moment of redemption? Is it not? Like, what's challenging about using that word in this context? And it's like,
yeah,
it's so
absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think like, I never thought of it as redemption necessarily. Like, I think sometimes we get into simplistic territory when we talk about like, is a human being redeemed for something terrible they've done? But I like the sort of the phrase that I was using in my head the whole time was just like this is somebody who's going to fight to his last breath to regain some sense of his own humanity that he never felt like he could reclaim ever again. And thinking through it in that lens of, somebody who's that desperate, but also like battling. And I just like had that moment when I was like thinking through like how his story would end. And I could sort of, instead of seeing the events, I could feel like what his sacrifices would feel like. And that was sort of how I found the end of his story.
So on that point, Stephen, about how it felt to write Keeper, in our case, read Keeper at the end, I think for me, and I think probably Emily, for you too, one of the ways he does like fit in with some of the other characters in the novel is that the conclusions to your chapters are often kind of like cosmic or prophetic. You used that word earlier. Was that a kind of like intentional technique level to provide a little bit of continuity? Like the end of a Tony chapter is often, about the crown of the world and Tony won, or when Quentin self-immolates at the end of the siege, like you're talking about kind of eons passing in a nanosecond, or the very end of Keeper's life, that like the conclusions to your chapters to us kind of establish some of the relationality at the level of the text, even if like the level of the characters wasn't always so obvious. Was that like an intentional thing that you were working through?
Yeah, it's an astute point. I think like I was always looking for strategies to zoom outwards on, the book spends so much time in granular detail about these characters. And so like just giving it that sense of scope and breadth was always really important to me, and situating these characters in this story and this like moment in our world in the context of something much, much bigger. I think a lot of the struggle of framing the climate crisis to people is in making them understand just how fucking crazy it is. Like we're talking about a geologic change we are executing upon our planet. And this is, people say, oh, the climate's always changed. It's changed here, it's changed now. But it really hasn't. Never this fast and never this violently. And so like the fact that we are the asteroid, that we are, or rather like a handful of billionaires really are the asteroid, sort of devastating our world, I think is like, it's so hard to like wrap your mind around. And so throughout the novel, I'm using these like techniques to like sort of create the idea of a geologic context, or like, a cosmic context, as you said. Like I think with any piece of writing where you're stretching yourself out to say something profound, or like to use a bit of poetry to try to explicate an idea, like you have to be very careful. That can easily go wrong. It can easily go over the top. And so I looked at all of the endings of those chapters very carefully and made sure I was calibrating them to say exactly the thing I wanted to say, or for the character to feel exactly the thing I wanted them to feel and relate to the audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that register of saying and feeling is a really important difference, right? To say something, mm-hmm. or to create that, the experience of it or the feeling of it through that affect is something we spend a lot of time talking about too.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Maybe we can turn to talk about Kate a little bit, if that's all right.
Sure.
So this is also one of my questions from my students. And so they write, so there are 6 main point of views, but Kate is potentially the most integral character to the novel. Why, other than kind of in the sea, should you decide not to make her a point of view? I guess I could add, other than obviously we want to have the Shane/Lucy reveal, but kind of at a broader level, why not make Kate a POV?
Interestingly, or maybe not interestingly, I don't know how interested anybody could be in like my intimate processes of this book. But
we're very interested.
Well, at least 2 people are. So this is a rapt audience. Yeah.
It's like as soon as you say a word like interestingly, the self-aggrandizement of it immediately occurs to you. So, but no, I began when I was first conceptualizing the book, and I'm talking about thinking about it in the years 2007 to 2010 before I started writing. I kind of always thought Kate would be told from multiple perspectives and from her own perspective, and that the book would just be full of her like the entire time. And then like the heaviness of that, or the way it might make the novel sag. Also the length, I understood, like the length was already always a problem, but I was like, oh, this is going to be a lot. Like I have to figure out a way to boil this down. And then like when I wrote the first chapter, from Matt's perspective, Matt was supposed to disappear later in the novel, and he was just going to be like this one single person who like sort of came and went in her life. And then I was like, oh, you know why this works so well? Why this Matt character as Kate's storyteller works so well? Not just because of the male gaze, which obviously we all love and adore, but because people who are larger than life in reality are always slightly removed from us. We never really know them. Like I was thinking about like even people throughout history who remain sort of ciphers to us, even if they did incredible things, right? This is not the same example, but at all. But like the way like these revelations of Cesar Chavez have come out, and that he actually was a pretty like disgusting predator and abusive to many women. Like this is an angle that like really like sort of rocks the narrative around this human being. And so anyway, so like looking at larger lives, not that Kate is that, but like looking at these larger than life figures, like we're always removed from them. We never really get inside their heads. We never know who they are. And so using that perspective, and then later Jackie's perspective on Kate, you get this sort of wider view of this woman who is just like absolutely through her force of her own will, like dragging this issue back into the public sphere. And to me, that's like sort of why the character ends up working so well, is because you never really get to know her except for that brief glimpse in The Siege. But that's sort of like how I landed on that technique.
Mm-hmm. And larger than life is right? I mean, like she lives on in many ways after her death. Or we were really struck by too the kind of recurrence in the 5th book to the moment of her death. So like every male character kind of begins in the last book with like what they were going through at the moment of like A, finding out she died, and B, like sitting through her funeral. And so there's like a way that the timelines even kind of coalesce around her death in this interesting sense. Yeah.
Right.
Larger than life indeed.
Kate was, I've taught this novel twice, kind of the most contentious character in the novel. Like everyone's pretty kind of on board with like, hey, redemption is a problematic category for Keeper, but everybody wants to explore that. Everyone kind of like willing to see through Shane's perspective from beginning to end, all of those kinds of things.
Right.
I'd say the most debates I've had in the classroom have been about Kate Morris in this novel. So that's just been really fascinating to me, like almost generationally, even though, I'm 20 years older than most of my students or so. I've wondered about like what the age at which you read this novel, how is that going to affect your interpretation of these characters?
Sure. And I mean, I think the contentiousness is like absolutely intentional on my part. It's like when you're creating the Joan of Arc character, they can't be sort of, I mean, this is like why, heroes in a modern Hollywood context are so boring and mindless, is that like they executives come in and sort of like explain like, oh, hero with his mortal flaw or her mortal flaw. And then they say the thing, it's all Luke Skywalker. It's all, sort of like boring Jesus narrative. And I was like, no, I want to put like a real flesh and blood human being at the center of this. And, her superpower is her charm and her ability to think through things and to try these new tactics. And when she fails, to like sort of grit her teeth and try again and never give up. But also she's a wrecking ball, and she's really willing to cast aside or, hurt people around her. And it's not something she really flinches at.
She's the most human character in terms of like, this is somebody who is brilliant and has a life project and is utterly and deeply flawed. In some way, she's the most human character to me. And that's the case I'm trying to make to my students, at least.
Yeah. And also problematic, but in a kind of has a lot of self-knowledge about that and navigates it in a really savvy way, which is an interesting kind of way to render a character like that. Can I building from Kate, ask you some social movements, kind of political sciencey questions, maybe. Yeah,
let's go.
Okay, so John and I are both.
This is a book of political theory, for the record.
Yeah, for the record,
yes,
this is one of our major arguments we make about the book is it is a text in political theory. We're both political theorists by training, teach in political science departments. So one of the big political science questions for us is social movements. So even just talking about Kate, right? Like Kate, all the pivots she makes, she could represent sort of like 4 or 5, maybe even different social movements approaches alone. But then there's this kind of like very simple surface level read of the book that's like, oh, the book gives us Fierce Blue Fire and 6 Degrees. They're like foils for each other as social movements. Mm-hmm. And like one of them has to be right? And that's like one way, I think, to wrongly read the book, right? The book paints like a much more complicated picture than that. And we have been saying that we think it actually doesn't make an argument for one over the other at all. But we were wondering sort of your approach to social movements. Like, is there a social movement approach that you think is vindicated here? And like, what was that process like?
Yeah. Okay. So enormous question. The number one like rule I set for myself in portraying these social movements in the book is that my opinion doesn't matter to what happens in the plot. Like as soon as I take into account my ideas as Stephen Markley, the human being, about what the climate movement should or should not do, I'm fucking up the narrative. I'm putting my thumb on the scale in a way that won't be helpful to telling a story or to, modeling social movements, which, I have to, with all humility, admit, like, we're not as far as we need to be on the climate movement. And I don't really know what will work. And all the time I talk to people who have different ideas of what will and will not work. And so this is like to some degree, I have to approach it with that humility, right? So that's point one. Point two is, when you think about the novels, global novels that have actually changed ideology and changed the world, they are things like, What Should Be Done? Uncle Tom's Cabin, which famously like began the Civil War, was a part of that sort of explosion in the 1850s. I think of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. And what do all these novels have in common? They fucking suck. They fucking suck a lot. They're really bad. And so when you're approaching a topic that is obviously like, I want to do something about climate change, this is like so deeply in my soul that like I can't do anything but write a 1,000-page book about it. The first thing I have to do is divorce my political beliefs from the writing of the novel and approach these like sort of two factions as if I am believing everything these people say. Like I'm on Shane's team. I'm writing through her point of view. Kate Morris is a hack. She's a stooge of the corporate state. She'll get in bed with like Republicans. She'll get in bed with horrible corporate Democrats. Like she's a fool, and there's no way what she's doing will work. So you have to embody that opinion. Then when you get over to Kate, you have to be like, these idiots are fucking everything up. They are giving the right wing a reason to crack down. They are fueling this backlash. Everything they're doing is compromising everything we've fought and gained. And so I think like the joy of that was, first of all, the research is just pouring through history and looking at everything you can about movements and like what has worked and what has not worked. You guys will know this research better than I do, but there was this study of like every social movement and found that nonviolent movements were always succeeding, whereas violent movements like had a much lower rate of success.
Erica Chenoweth, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Chenoweth, that's it. Yes. And so this is something that I paid a lot of attention to and all the rest. But, still in the climate movement, you'll talk to people today who are saying like, look at Trump, look at what's happened in America. Like clearly this has been useless. There's no way that would like the corporate state will ever relent. They're full of psychopaths. Like you're a fool for thinking anything else. And so anyway, the book is like this big argument between like what tactics will work, what ideas will work, what are we, how do we organize ourselves to create this really like momentous change? I think like one of the challenges of the climate crisis is that the speed with which the social movement has to work And like I say this like not to be flip about it, but like if the movement to end slavery had not succeeded and we still had slavery today, like the planet would not be going through this most perilous moment. Like there are other social movements that if they hadn't succeeded, humanity would have ground on in its miserable, its sort of violent, miserable history would have continued. The difference here is that we're destabilizing our entire atmosphere, which is going to destabilize everything about our politics and our economy and basically anything else we can conceive of, right? And so the terror that lies on the other side if this fails is so much bigger than I think people can really comprehend right now. That was a very rambling answer. I hope I landed on something that...
Yeah, absolutely.
No, it was great.
I mean, so even the part where you ended, I think, is meaningful for us. So we've made the comparison that, okay, if the policies that are passed in Book 5 were to pass in the United States in 10 years from now in our world, right, that would be the most transformative development in American politics since Reconstruction.
Like ever.
It was kind of the idea we were thinking about. So I think that makes sense. I mean, given that, and I think that kind of rule of you have to kind of fully take on the perspective of Kate, the perspective of Shane, works extremely well for the novel. So it's a cliche to say like the personal is the political or whatever. And so we actually get like this extreme moment of that when we learn that Lucy from Book 1 is in fact Shane, which totally transforms us as readers, the way we read all of Shane's actions and her thoughts about Kate and all of Kate's actions throughout the novel. And the fact that Kate potentially could have like told the FBI in any number of ways, directly or indirectly, like, okay, I know who one person was at one point is one of the principles of 6 degrees. So when we as a reader, when you as a writer write towards that at the end of the novel, how are you thinking about like that personal reveal at the level of kind of social movement politics?
Okay, well, there's several components to this. One is just like the juicy spy versus spy nature of it, you know?
So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Love it. Yeah.
Yeah. Like one thing about the Deluge that I always tell people is I know it looks like it's going to be like a pain in the ass to read, but it's not. It's like, you tear through it. It is a blast. And that I think is like sort of key to my thinking about how you get people wrapped up in a 1,000-page climate novel is like, keep it hurtling, keep it moving like a freight train, especially in that last part when these big revelations, these big mysteries are coming, to the forefront. The second part of that is I always just love, I mean, anytime you get to write towards a moment of two characters sort of like at an irreconcilable head, like that's a joy, like you putting people in a room and having them fight, figuratively, I mean, is like the best feeling because that's when you get like sort of the moments that crackle in literature, is when two characters are really facing off and you're seeing the world, like, how far apart they are, their different perspectives, and how, the heartbreak of having them pulled apart by this irreconcilable issue. The third part of that is that at that point, the reader hopefully picks up on, or maybe like at least like intuits that yes, Kate had many, many, many opportunities to turn this person in and chose not to. So again, in that, to me, that always meant that like she has the humility as well, that she, like, fuck these people. What they're doing is ruined. But like, what if they're not? What if she's right?
Yeah.
And like, I can't risk, turning her in just in case she's the one who's right. And I think that again, like sort of speaks to the unknown nature of trying to foment a political change on this kind of scale.
Can I pull out one other little thing from your social movements answer? You talked about how fun the research was. Were there any particular historical social movements that you discovered for the first time during that research, or ones that really you were thinking with a lot or really liked learning about, that informed in some way the discussion in the book?
Yeah, I wish I'd had prep for that question because I could have poured through my head a little bit more. I think like the anarchist movement in the US was a big one. That was like something I knew like vaguely about from whatever history courses you take in one's education. But I think that was a really like sort of eye-opening thing. And, like honestly, the 1960s, which is sort of just pop culture now, but like, it's so fucking wild to me that there were like bombs going off in American cities basically all the time in the late 60s and 70s. And if that were happening today, like the fucking country would melt down. like you wouldn't be able to go outside. People would be so incensed about it. And so just thinking about like some of those movements was, I think, very helpful. And obviously I'm making the reference to the Weathermen and all the rest. So.
Yeah.
Anti-colonial movements were also a big one, because I think like those movements really, like many of them won through violent means, won through, like actual armed resistance. That was an important one. There are more. I'm just like, I'd have to like pour back through my head.
Well, I imagine I don't even know what's the file process like for researching a novel that takes you this long to write. We were both like, we wrote dissertations, but they did not. You can't take 12 years to do that, or they kick you out. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. No, I mean, it's like the research process it happened over such a long period of time, and it was so intensive and so like, the only thing I really regret about it is that I spoke to so many interesting people during this period. Like famous, like the most famous or the most important one to me was James Hansen, the NASA scientist. But I recorded none of it. I have none of it on audio, and I'm just like, all I have are like the notes that I mostly threw away. And I'm just like, God, like what a repository of bizarre people that you went after, just as research for this book. So I kind of regret that part.
That feels like its own novel there.
Since we're talking about Shane, maybe we can kind of turn to this next. There's this moment in the first Shane chapter where her and Murdoch are at the diner, and they have this conversation about invisible infrastructures, right? So the line is, this is from Shane: "Sometimes I think it was better when American kids were dying and getting maimed and put invisible infrastructures in front of people on their television screens." And that's followed by Murdoch's catch up as imperial maintenance soliloquy, which Emily and I love. Emily and I probably oversimplistically read that perhaps as a little bit of a thesis for the novel in terms of its political work. So kind of like, where did that phrase come from for you? Or like, what does that phrase invoke for you of putting invisible infrastructures in front of people?
Geez, John, in a book of like 300,000 words, I'm not sure I can really remember exactly my thinking. In hindsight, what it means, or in the specific phrase is like during the Iraq War, Halliburton and KBR became household names. Blackwater became a household name. And it's just like sort of the maliciousness and the callousness of the corporate state came into very stark repose. And to me, that was what Lucy Shane, is referring to. But, it's one of those things where, I don't know, I just think about like, I have this argument all the time where people are like, well, as soon as Trump's gone, like this movement will fall apart. Like it's falling apart. He's going to be out the window, and then things will return to normal. It's like, no, that's like the exact wrong and way to look at this. That this person is a symptom of these underlying infrastructures, not the cause. And I think like, when we look at politics that way, is this like is this battle of personalities, even like very bombastic personalities, we're missing everything. And so again, like looking at, and the Deluge is very much a novel about like, especially Jackie's sections, what are the invisible infrastructures undergirding inaction on the climate crisis?
We love that phrase, invisible infrastructure. We were trying to figure out if anyone had used it in political theory scholarship, and it doesn't seem like it yet. So if we write anything with it, we'll credit you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I like to go 2 for 330,000. So
there are at least 20 more. So yeah. Okay, while we're sort of laughing, I want to ask you a question about kind of violence and humor here. So this novel, you talked before in your discussion of like Keeper and the sort of violence of climate change, but Keeper has an incredible proximity to violence in the broadest sense at kind of every level, not just the violence of climate change, the violence of the police state, the violence of prison, right? The violence of and of white supremacy, right? And so many kind of layers of violence. So this is an incredibly violent novel in general, but we also think it's a hysterical novel, incredibly funny.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
My copy is riddled with like little marginal LOLs at like every line that just stopped me and like laughing out loud in moments where I wasn't expecting to be laughing. So just sort of at the level.
LOL yikes became like a shorthand for us. Like this is just an incredible turn of phrase in a very kind of like confrontational sort of way, which we love.
Yeah. So at the level of technique, how did you approach kind of the relationship between violence and humor?
I just think you're trying to catalog human experience, and when you're writing a super dark novel, there's always moments of humor. Like a show that is like foundational to like my writing life is The Wire, which is another which I think is like closer to a piece of literature than it is to a TV show. But that's a show that's about some of the darkest shit you can in American life, and at the same time, it's hilarious. And I just think like especially people in dire conditions tend to be really funny. They tend to have a gallows outlook on things. And and also just like the writerly joy of getting to Tony's like, his like absolutely snarling cynicism. And then like, just that one beat of like a quick line, like that's always, it's so much pleasure in writing something like that. And so, so there's that element that like, I just because we live in like a, destabilizing, violent world, like we're all making jokes about it constantly.
Yeah.
And, like having worked in some TV writers' rooms now with, the shows don't reflect it as much that I've worked for, but like certainly the writers inside like joke so ferociously about like death and the tragedies in their lives. And like some really dark stuff that you're like, I don't know, like, is that happened to you? That's horrible. But like, the way they can bring that sort of like acid joke to it is, I think, just such an impressive skill. And so it's just something I've come to really appreciate.
Yeah, I love that Tony was your kind of reference point there. We thought Tony hysterical, but Tony and Ash's friendship was also for us just like this really sweet, something that brought us a lot of joy. But we also find Ash incredibly funny too, right? Like the way he's navigating other humor like as a artifact to be dealt with and tried to parse through, but like while being funny himself, his relationship not only with Tony but with Peter, just like so many great moments of like levity, but also like real comedy in these moments that are like challenging, difficult, dark, heavy, and so on. So
for sure.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned earlier, the humility you tried to bring to like the social movement conversation. And I'm struck, Emily and I, this is not, despite being a novel that's engaging climate change, it's not a particularly didactic novel. Is that like an intention you were kind of bringing as well to thinking about how you would write the violence that characters committed, experienced, observed, commented on? Like what kind of, what's your intentionality such as it is in writing this kind of violence that's exploding all these different ways, large scale and small scale throughout the novel?
Well, first off, you'll have to talk to my editor about the book not being didactic, because he was really on me to cut 17 pages of ocean acidification.
No, can't cut that.
It was like the amount I had to cut that was basically just like, oh, let's dive deep into the science on, sulfur aerosols. So like whittling that away was sort of a project of the edit. And as for the violence,
that's a hilarious kind of political point though, right? That like, you're like, here's some scientific facts and that is like too didactic, right? Like that's fascinating.
Yeah. To me. I mean, even I, who can put up with a lot of that shit, like I acknowledge it is at some point grates on the reader. I mean, I remember one of my mentors in Hollywood, Dan Fogelman, who writes the Paradise Show. He read the novel and he was like, at first, like he's like, I got into this first chapter and I'm reading, about methane cathodes, and I'm like, my guy has lost his mind. Like Ohio is an instant classic, and he has fucked up his life and his career with this book. Like I don't know what the hell he's going to do. But then, as that chapter ends, he's like, oh, and then went on to love the book. So it's one of those things where like, you really have to be crafty about how you're eating, you're handing out vegetables to the audience. But like, again, to the humor of it, it's like when I had the character of Ash in my head, I was like, this is how you deploy big ideas, is give it to this like fascinating person who was modeled on like a few different, and like modeled in a way that I was like, nobody specifically I knew, but I had like crept into like finding the humor in a person who is looking at the world so differently was a way that I thought was amazing to get out information that would take up a lot of space. I'm sorry, I totally forgot your question about violence now.
No, that's fine. That's, I think, totally works. And actually, maybe now, Emily, is a good time to think about the AI question.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Let's do it.
So this is another one of the questions my students wrote. And, you know, they make the observation that AI, as it exists in our world, produces writing that lacks emotion. And yet in the chapters in the novel that are fully or partially or ambiguously AI reconstruction. So Shane's chapters,
Right.
The Siege, Tony's ghost-written
Yeah,
AI
all of Tony,
chapters.
question mark, yeah.
There are a lot of insights into how characters are feeling. So how did you approach kind of that AI and emotionality relationship?
Okay. So what is so important here is, again, like the way the novel caught up to reality too quickly, or reality caught up to my novel rather.
Yeah.
Which is that when I was first conceiving of this big idea for the book, that you wouldn't know certain chapters were told through the perspective of basically large language models. I didn't know the term large language model. I just saw like the writing on the wall of where the technology would go. And my conception of it was that the most important thing about, you know, being able to gather this huge amount of data and spew stuff out about it was surveillance and law enforcement, right? So like that to me was like sort of one of the keys of the book, was that like at some point surveillance capitalism and sort of the surveillance state are going to become so good at what they do that they will be able to create these like reconstructions of what was this suspect up to? Who was he? Where did he come from? It's as if like the guy who took a shot at Trump, you could just like rewrite his life, like ask the computer, why did he do this? And then the computer spits out his life story, right?
I mean, this is Peter Thiel's dream, right? This is Palantir's
Yes,
dream.
Exactly. And so that to me was sort of the dystopian, though not really dystopian because it's barreling towards us. That was sort of the dystopian root of the idea that like, eventually large language models would sort of conquer human consciousness and be able to give these really creepy documents backfilling in a life. For me, what has happened though with actual AI is that it's like an incredibly overhyped technology built on the plagiarism of people like me who've worked their asses off their entire lives. And probably you guys too, right? Like, I am someone who's incredibly skeptical that this technology is going to wipe away white collar work, or like the fucking God is going to rise out of the silicone. What I think has happened is that the media is doing a lot of hype laundering for some billionaire assholes who are trying to get the biggest IPO they possibly can. And that this is distorting, our economy and our sort of social engagement with each other in these really terrible ways. And like everybody's talking about the bubble right now. Will the bubble pop? And I think like even if the bubble pops and sort of this technology is revealed to be the mechanical Turk that I think it is, the consequences will still be really dreadful for society with not a lot of upside. And here I'm talking very much about like large language models and generative AI. Obviously, there are uses for like, moving electricity around a grid that big data sets can be really useful for, right? But in the big scheme of things, like where this technology has gone, LLMs is not what is happening in the book. The book is still talking about a very fictional technology that can write something with poetry, and that probably because it's plagiarized Stephen Markley has like a great skill and depth and scope of literary talent.
In a world now, like in the temporality of reading the novel The Deluge, in a world where like we have OpenAI and Grok and Anthropic and all of this, like, does that change how you think about the use of AI in the novel, quote unquote?
Yeah, well, let me say this: if I had been writing this novel in this decade instead of the last one, I never would have included this concept because like I don't want to sort of lend credence to what I think are like these abusive technologies. But at the time, I was like, we should be thinking about a computer that can fucking write an essay as a Shakespeare sonnet, you know, like about political theory. Like we should think about something that could do that. So I finished the first draft of this novel with all of this included in 2020, turned it in February to 2020 to my editor. I remember this conversation so distinctly where he was like, I find the idea of a computer that can write this much a little far-fetched.
Fascinating.
That was an early, yes. And so that was an early reaction that I got to the novel from not just him, but other people as well. And I was like, I really think we should keep it in because so like 20 years from now, we'll see something that like resembles this, right? And it'll look prescient. I did not know ChatGPT was coming out in 3 years. And 3 years was when the book pubbed. Like it pubbed right before ChatGPT came out, basically. So, it's one of those things where, again, like scaring myself because the way the book, sort of intersects with reality, the book goes nowhere really nice. So it's sometimes a little, it freaks me out.
Yeah, I mean, we had moments in book 5 where, when the reveal, right, when in Matt 5 happens, and I guess there's multiples, right? We get the reveal at the end of Tony, right, that his chapters are done by his ghostwriter, right, his AI ghostwriter, and then we learn about the reconstructions in Matt, and we were like, okay, so this raises the question of whether, like, the whole novel is written by Matt via AI, collecting via AI, Jackie's reconstructions, Shane's reconstructions. Is Shane even real, right? Or Lucy? I don't know.
Yeah.
I heard you at that slip earlier, and I was wondering whether in your mind Shane is Lucy or Shane. But it raises so many questions that I think you're right. Like they're different questions now than they were when the book first came out. So even reading it, I read it in 2023 and then reading it again over the course of the last 2 years to do the podcast was a totally different experience. It was really interesting. I can't even imagine what it must have been like to be sitting with it for so long and to have all these things happen in quick succession right afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that is like, look, I like that element of the book. I think it offers this really like interesting reveal. And I should also double back. This is what I was going to say earlier. Like something that I really, really enjoy in novels is the failure of omniscience and sort of the way in which like no two people ever see the same event the same way. And no two large language models can ever talk about an event in the same way. But this fallacy that we have, in ninth grade English class, you call it the unreliable narrator, but just that, I think is sort of more properly defined as like omniscience is a figment of the human imagination. It doesn't actually exist. And particularly right now when, you have these sort of cult leaders in Silicon Valley going around talking about like the all-knowing silicon god that's going to rise, out of the data centers. It's like, no, if that happens, that's not what it's going to be. It's not going to know everything. It's going to be quite stupid and, probably turn us all into paper clips. That's the more likely, scenario. And so even with the Deluge, it's like you're looking at these world historic events through the eyes of these, large language models, these machines. How much can we trust them? How do we know this is the way events occurred? Like, I guess we can sort of cross-reference them with these other characters who are telling their story. But how real are those perspectives as well? So
we talk about this a lot in the podcast as using the kind of feminist epistemology and philosophy of science term standpoint theory, right? That like piecing that the aspiration for an objective account of the world that is itself political, right? There's there's an argument in there, and it's a that is disavowing itself. And so to acknowledge that perspective and that standpoint is to, in some sense, repair the kind of harm of that aspiration for objectivity or omniscience in this case.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't want to come across as a total like Derridian here. I do think the search, I do think that the search for truth and like the veracity of like, a given story is something that is being totally discounted right now. And, journalists are basically like, have evaporated from the public conversation, and all that's happening is the destabilization of what is real and what is not. So I don't want to go so far in the other direction, but that is the theory behind the chapters and the way they're told.
Well, I mean, it goes back to even where you started talking about Keeper. Like, we need Keeper, much like we need Monitza as a person, Monitza as a journalist, much like we need Shane and we need Matt, like all of these people to tell some sort of coherent, moving towards truth about climate change or something like that.
Yeah.
Because I think, we appreciated the way the novel takes that idea so seriously at the level of form and what that leads to in the end. Simultaneously, though, like, we also were catching several points at which the novel a little bit kind of questions its own function or questions its like own political work. So, the Tony is AI ghostwriter, the like kind of asides in a couple different places about like the market or the demand for climate books, or Matt and Matt 5 writing about how he can't finish The Years of Rain and Thunder. Like, is that a self-conscious or intentional choice, or is that kind of something that found its way into the novel in the course of the years of working on it?
Yeah, that might be one of those subconscious things on my part, but certainly you don't write a 1,000-page novel about the climate crisis without questioning what stories about the climate crisis have previously done, and what might be told in the future. And so I think like I'm always thinking about how do you narrativize something that is so difficult to wrap your head around?
Yeah. And in some ways resists narrative, I guess.
Resists narrative,
yeah. So to follow up on that, how much is Matt a sort of stand-in for you?
Yeah, I mean,
as the author.
Not really at all. Like, I understand it's like sort of like his physical characteristics, or his yearning to be a writer. That is like in the vaguest sense autobiographical, but not really. The way the book started was I did work in the Grand Teton National Park the year after I graduated from college, and that was like working on the docks and falling in love and like all that other stuff that comes with being a young person who's like absolutely so hungry to just like shred the world into. All of that is packed into that chapter, which I wrote. Got like early in the process, like 2010 probably. But where it departs is, once you get past the setting and sort of some of those initial things, is I'm like, okay, who is this person actually? Because he's not me. Like, this is somebody with entirely different set of things he wants out of life. His yearning for this woman that he's attached himself to, and his inability to realize sort of himself as the writer he wants to be. I think we're sort of definitional things that I followed. And it's also like very much like, what if I never had written Ohio? What if like I had taken that job in the, with the public interest research group and never really like realized any of this like absolutely, like knock down, drag out ambition that I seem to have. Like, what would my life feel like? And obviously you try to go and encounter that set of emotions, the way you try to encounter any set of emotions really a character has. But yeah, sorry, that's like a mealy-mouthed answer, but yeah.
No, I loved it because also when John brought up the question of didacticism and you referenced Ash chapters. So one of my conspiracy theories about the novel is that actually Ash is more of a stand-in for Stephen Markley, the author, than Matt.
So astute. That is so astute.
Yeah. I was like, this is where he's really telling us like what he wants us to come away with the novel from. But like this form is giving him distance from the real Proxy, and Matt Matt's the shroud.
The red herring. Yeah, the red herring. Yeah.
Well, listen, if you talk to my sister who never gets tired of giving me shit, she's like, immediately when she read the book, she's like, oh, you're Ash. Like, you put on a better facade, but this is your weird robot brain down to its T. Like, this is exactly what you're like. And I was like, okay, thanks, Anna. Yeah.
That's also amazing too, because their dynamic, the sibling dynamic between Ash and Hanaya in the novel is very touching. Yes. And it also feels very real, which leads me to another just kind of theme that was really interesting for us that if you would care to say a couple things about. The theme of kind of family and the question of parenthood is one that struck us as really actually both of us on first read of the novel, one we didn't realize was so central, but on second read, really struck by that through line that everybody's wrestling with, like the question of children, the question of the future, the question of what do we leave behind? What do we owe? What are, is it even ethical, right? What does it mean to parent kind of in a warming planet? So just wondering if you could reflect a bit on that question, its place in the novel, and more broadly, kind of what that was like writing that part of it.
Totally. I mean, that's such a central element of the novel. Just that, like, okay, if we acknowledge this is all real, which I assume most people reading the book do, like what we have scheduled for 2030, 2050, 2070 is really, really scary. And I think, again, it's sort of beyond our ability right now to even wrap our minds around, because the disruptions are going to be so enormous and catastrophic and unpredictable. There's now all this literature flying around in climate world about the shutting down of the AMOC is like a real thing that could happen in our lifetimes.
Which is another thing where it's like the book actually brings up, like, okay, now we're concerned that the Mid-Atlantic current is going to fail, like in the novel as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like, when you think about something like that, you're talking about like a level of catastrophe that will not just be visited upon Europe, but will, echo across the planet. That like nobody right now can wrap our minds around. Like insurance markets can't price something like that. It doesn't exist. So when you think about a future that uncertain and that dangerous, I look at my friends' children being born right now, and I'm just like, what are you going to live through? I'm already worried about what I'm going to live through, frankly. But when you look at kids who will be, my friend's just had a baby and she's very cute and brand new. So it's 2026. She's born in 2026. So she'll be 30 in 2056. And the stuff that is on schedule for 2056 right now is like really, really mind blowing. Especially given our sort of really halting path at arresting carbon emissions, which, perhaps we're making progress on. Some people think that we might be able to at least, if not bend the curve, like have them peak and plateau in this decade, but that still leaves potentially, 2-3 degrees of warming. And we're already seeing at this very low level of warming effects that scientists just couldn't predict. And so I guess like when you think about the future like that, you think about parenting, you think about children, you think about like, mothers and fathers willing to, I've heard it phrased like this, like, I am not a parent, by the way, which is why I can write parents and children so well.
I think that's totally true. Yeah.
That robotic Ash-like objectivity, right? But no, when parents talking about that, like now that this little thing exists, there's like a piece of you walking around in the world that you want to protect at all costs. Only nobody ever thinks about that in terms of this like massive catastrophe that's befalling us on this planet right now. It's always in terms of, are the microplastics okay for her? Is like the vaccine bad for her? It's like, will they be shot in school, et cetera, which are, some of which are like reasonable things to worry about and act upon. But the big one, the one that overhangs everything else, I feel like is almost missing from anyone's conception as they enter parenthood. Save like Naomi Klein. But like, to me, just like the flippant nature with which, people enter into that really like, the relationship of their life, the way in which they embark upon it without thinking about the future is always bizarre to me. And maybe I've been a little like ungenerous in this formulation, but, certainly writing the book, it was hard not to think about that particularly.
Well, I think you're generous with it in the novel. I mean, we were really struck by the Ash-Seth debate, and that like they keep arguing about it as like trying to find a rational basis for it. And John and I were like, why doesn't Seth just tell as he knows it's irrational and he wants to do it anyway, like this, like the both and the dialectic. But like, that's sort of how people in our world who are thinking about climate change and violence and things and have children, right? That's like one of the things you were just talking about is there's this like individual level of, or the concerns about the future become really distilled to these like individual level things. Like I have to protect my child from microplastics because that's all I can do. It's the most I can do, rather than this collective thing, right? Which is that like, we cannot fight climate change by individually deciding not to use straws or whatever, right? It's this massive, huge collective action problem. And like to think about child rearing as a collective, puzzle is something that's really challenging to do in a world that renders everything so individual. So I read your answer is actually more generous than I think maybe you
well
heard
put.
It.
Better put than me. Yes. Yeah.
It's one of Emily's core skills. There's the other kind of side of that, I think, though, is like, what are the characters in the novel? And this is, one of the basic things a novel can do, or any kind of piece of art that accesses some form of interiority. Like, how are they unthinkingly responding to or reenacting things from their own parents? Like I think about Jackie here a lot, and like Jackie's conversations with her mom, which culminate in her finding her mom's dead body after the flood. And so like, there's also not only the like, okay, well, are we going to have kids or not? What does it mean to raise children in a heading towards catastrophe world? But also like the way these characters in their understanding of their own life projects are trying to think through what they take from their parent. How Jackie specifically, or some of the other characters, like how do you understand them to be affected by their own kind of family dynamics?
Well, I just think it's so key to building any character is you're trying to think about where they came from. And obviously one of the biggest influences is like, what were their parents like, like who were they as people? And so you sort of have to, in order to write any character, you sort of have to, you get the step one is them, and step two is like, okay, what milieu created them? And you need sort of that calibration that makes sense in the story of their lives. But then you end up just writing this enormous backstory of these two other people, and you're sort of creating this family tree. And even if you end up using almost none of that in the book, I find that like it buttresses the character, him or herself, in a really important way.
We can kind of ask, I mean, this is in some ways a bit of a cliche question, but it's tied to the kind of question of the podcast. Like, having written The Deluge, do you think the term, the climate novel, cli-fi, any of these, like, are those useful genre categories either in general or like for this novel in particular, do you think?
I mean, I don't really have an opinion one way or the other on the use of genre titles. I think it's for, academics and marketing people, guys. Yeah. That's who needs them. But
shots fired, but correct to put it on the same level as like Jackie when she's doing her advertisements.
Right. No, I mean, I think to me, The Deluge is a realist literary novel. Like that's what it is. It takes place in the future, but it is not attempting, it's attempting a thought experiment rather than like a sci-fi imagining of our future. And I think one of the greatest strengths of the novel is that it's not introducing anything outlandish. It is our political reality. It is our economic reality. It's our social reality. It's about who we are right now and what we can do and what we're choosing not to do. And that's where it gets its power from. And it doesn't attempt to create any institutions or any technologies that are either magic bullets or, sort of devastating consequences. It's grounded so firmly in what we have. And then, look, this is a criticism that I've gotten before that I just I don't typically engage with this sort of stuff, but when people are like, why couldn't you write a more utopian vision, like something about the hope of where we're going? I'm like, motherfucker, look out the window. Utopia is off the table. That's not happening. And so people dreaming their revolutionary dreams that we're going to wake up and, the eco-socialist world government's going to save us is just as crazy to me as pretending there's an AI magic God that's going to come and fix this for us. unfortunately, what we're stuck with is each other and the tools we have at hand, like solar panels and windmills, to get us the fuck out of this in some way that leaves a habitable planet and hopefully, pushes as many of the planet's people through this tight keyhole in as safe and just a way as possible. Like, that's what we have. Those are the options at hand. And anything that strays from that, to me, is bad science fiction.
Mm-hmm. That's a lovely sequel to Kate's speech that's depicted in the Vanity Fair article by Munitsa early in the novel. But I think that the only credible hope, if that's even a relevant category, it might actually be in the realism and lack of a deus ex machina, that whatever hope we might resolve ourselves to at the end of the novel comes from. So is hope a relevant concept for you for this novel at all?
I think it was Gramsci that said this, optimism of the will, something. There's a saying there that now I have to look it up. So
optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect, right? That's
yes. That Gramsci. Yes. Thank you. Yes, that's it. So I am super pessimistic right now about where we're headed. And I think the book makes it clear. The problem is we've already released so much carbon in the atmosphere that we are headed for a really frightening situation for the rest of the 21st century. There's no way around it. There's no magic technology coming. People who think we're going to suck carbon out of the sky don't understand the amount of carbon we have to suck out of the sky in order to accomplish that. So there's this element to where I think right now they're talking about with this El Nino that's coming, we could hit 1.7 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels next year, which when I was writing this book 10 years ago, that sounds crazy. That would have sounded so crazy to me. But we're going to be there. And so, you immediately have to tell yourself this is going to be bad no matter what. Now it's all about how do we, you're a fucking doctor on the pit. How do we, triage the situation as well as we possibly can?
Yeah, triage, I think, is right.
Yeah, and because we were doing, what is the level of sea level rise or the temperature level in the novel compared to how have projections for the relevant time period changed from when the novel was, written or conceived or where it's set in the novel to now, and it is quite eerie in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, there's a section I read from Kate's rant in the Vanity Fair article. I read that section. And in the last 3 years, the projections I have in the book that I think are September of 2020, November of 2026 is when she's saying these projections. And, she's saying we're this many parts per million in the atmosphere and we're this many degrees. Those are all now wrong because we've blown past them.
The ppm of later in the novel than we are currently in our world. So yes, we are greater levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in our world now than in later dates in the novel.
Which is also a mindfuck because if you read The Deluge in 2023, the opening of the book is a slightly accelerated climate change from our world. But when you read it in 2026, we have accelerated.
That's right.
That's crazy.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Can I pick up on the Gramsci reference and ask if you'd be willing to do just a quick little game with us? So there were so many references in the book that we absolutely loved that we were both wondering, how did you read all this stuff? But also just how did this one kind of get name dropped in the book? So we were wondering if we could just have a couple go back and forth and give you a reference we liked and have you say quickly kind of what that reference is doing there.
Okay.
Or something about the reference.
No, that's fine. It's been a while since I've read this book, so if I can't remember, I'll have to say I can't remember, but that's
no problem. Yes. Okay, can we start with Hannah Arendt, Men in Dark Times?
Well, I was just thinking about what Kate might be reading in 2018, and I was thinking about her as a character and what was going on then. so much about imagining a character. I know nobody reads anymore, so future characters I write will not read any books because that's unfortunately the situation we're in. But
my students read your novel twice, so we celebrate, my group of young students at SUNY Plattsburgh.
Yes, absolutely. My God. Yeah. But yeah, that was mostly just like, okay, what would Kate be reading right now? That's basically how it ended up. Yeah.
I love that. So you have a chapter title, right? So Tony's fourth chapter, Leviathan. So what does that reference kind of communicate for you?
Well, that reference is obvious. I mean, it's the classic, right? But it more specifically references this book, which I found very interesting by Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright. I wanted to make sure I got the name right. 2018 book, Climate Leviathan, which gives out this political theory of the future of the climate crisis. Leviathan being like the most likely outcome. Now, there are things in this book I disagreed with, but let me just quickly explain. Climate Leviathan is this idea that we're going to get a sort of neoliberal global governance that will manage the horrors of the climate crisis, whilst potentially slowly abating fossil fuels in whatever marginal ways it can. And then he offers these other theories, Climate Mao, which is more of like a Chinese communist idea of the future, and then Climate Behemoth, which is what we're currently living through, which is sort of like also what the Deluge proposes as well, with a character like the pastor, which is sort of like we are engulfed by a pro-fossil fuels, pro-God, pro-guns, pro-murder immigrants type government, and those governments basically come to power all over the world. And so, those guys just they missed which political theory they should have chased. Yes.
Well, one of the secret
Climate Leviathan sounds pretty fucking good right now. So,
well, one of the secret questions behind the questions was, had you read Climate Leviathan? Because it's all over this book. Even the name Climate X, right? To what Kate is associated.
Exactly. And I think obviously a book like that is going to have its ups and downs as a predictive model of the future. Mm-hmm. But at the time when I was searching for books, this is right when I'm finishing the novel too, I was just sort of perplexed that nobody really thought through this idea of what governance is going to feel like as this crisis escalates. And so theirs was really the first book I saw that they really tried to grapple with where all this was headed. And so I wanted to pepper the novel with as many sort of not as many, but I wanted to give them credit so that people like you could come along and figure it
out.
We both of us teach that book, and so but when we read that chapter for the podcast, we paired it with Thomas Hobbes with the OG Leviathan, just to stretch our political theory brains to be okay, let's read Hobbes as an ecological thinker. But
and then in Ash 5, I think we had the question of are the policies that are passed in Ash 5 what
which
percent climate Leviathan, what percent Climate Mao, what percent Climate X are they?
Another political theory guy in the Siege. There's a reference to state of exception.
State of exception is just what you feel like we've been living in since 9/11. That's really using that phrase is just I remember that from the early days of people arguing against the Patriot Bill. And as we've seen over the last 26 years, 25 years, it's when you get a state of exception, it never really goes away. It becomes the norm. And so I thought it was interesting to sort of introduce that, that phrase in terms of what is going on around Washington in that time.
Shane's cipher with Tinkerbell is the parable of the sower. And so when I teach this class where I teach your novel, the other novel we read is the parable of the sower. So what does that novel mean to you?
I've read it. I can't claim that it was a major influence because I read it in 2021, before the book came out, but after I'd finished. Just that, I knew it was people kept mentioning it as sort of the foundational climate crisis text. But I had stayed away from reading almost any climate books, or climate novels, I should say, at all. I really, while I was writing it, didn't want to touch any of them. But yeah, that one, just sort of thinking through what book would Shane find useful in her life.
Well, I appreciate the cred you gained me with my students when I was I had totally forgotten about this, and yet here we are. We're going to read these two novels together, and it's actually in the Deluge.
In the novel,
central character has that book.
Yeah.
For her. So thank you for that.
Okay, we have to ask, Shane rides the panopticon. Panopticon here?
Panopticon, yeah.
Is this a Michel Foucault reference?
The panopticon is, but like rides the panopticon is a Markley original.
Great. That's a
great.
Okay. One. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I love I mean, obviously, like I'm not the first person to point out that our surveillance state is purely resembles a massive panopticon where everybody feels like they're being watched all the time. We kind of are being watched all the time, but the actual watcher can't sort through the massive amounts of data that exists to figure anything out. So we're left in this state of total surveillance and also complete ignorance. I find that very compelling.
So Cormac McCarthy is kind of the central author in Jackie 1, right? Where she meets the actor who eventually becomes the pastor. Like, is McCarthy on your mind at other points in this novel?
No, I mean, McCarthy faded from I just feel like you can't write any novel about the end of the world without a little mention of McCarthy. Yeah. So if you're going to be tipping your cap to like all these different novels and authors, he's the author for me that like when I read The Road when it first came out, I mean, I was much younger at the time, but like, I was just like, oh, like he ended the genre. Like he did the version of the post-apocalyptic wandering through the ruins thing. And believe me, I work on a show now about this very idea. And I'm like, we're not doing this good as McCarthy. Like, obviously, like he ended the genre and everything that's come along since then has been a pale imitation. And it's just like, no, like he did the thing. So,
okay. What about, we got to ask Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones. Where specifically is that?
Okay,
Tony's favorite series and show, and right,
like that's
all of Tony's, right, the cat, the dog, right, one of the daughters.
Yes,
Khaleesi for
Tyrion the cat. Yeah.
Well, I pictured Tony as like he's a pure scientist and will read junk novels, and his favorite novels are Game of Thrones, and he's like enamored of the show, and sort of the timing of when that chapter is taking place. I was like, what's the popular thing in the world right now on TV? And so I sort of just used it as like a little thread in the book.
I was just going to say, I really love that because when Game of Thrones was on TV, it was actually political scientists loved that show, like as academics, not just as like a kind of escapism, like junk thing. And so I was like, oh, I love that this is Tony the scientist, like approaching Tony the political scientist. It tickled me.
Yeah. And this was never intentional. Like I had conceived of the Deluge well before I had seen Game of Thrones, but I do think there is like this similarity of the multi-character perspective, the sort of the political machinations. Like I guess it has similar DNA, certainly.
And there's there's an interpretation of Song of Ice and Fire series that's about climate change, which George R. R. Martin is disavowed, but it's there.
Stephen, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. I really appreciate.
Yeah, well, I mean, teaching my novel, sure.
Well, we also gave a talk kind of at what was the conference?
Environmental Philosophy Conference.
Yeah, kind of using this notion of invisible infrastructure and talking about the deluge. And somebody on our panel had met you. I think that he was in a master's class. His professor had assigned it and they had all read it. So I think like it's doing a lot of work in classrooms, which I don't know if that's something you had hoped for it to do, but it seems like that's
I would have taken more book sales, but yeah, that's good. The book is obviously, it was written to come out in 2023, but my hope is that it has a longer shelf life and that it even as it doesn't predict perfectly world events, that its central message and themes will survive into posterity and that it will have these second and third lives. Like, I think it was very much designed to be a book that can be read 10, 15, 20, 50 years from now, with a hindsight look at like where we were at that point and also how far we've come and how far we might have to go.
Mm-hmm. Well, like Ash's final chapter, I think Emily and I certainly believe this novel is something written for posterity and to posterity.
Thank you.